Greetings, everyone. This is Virtuous Roots, where we reclaim virtue to bring it to our home and yours. And I'm Thomas McCuddy.
And I'm Stacy McCuddy.
I'm Nick Wiegand. And tonight's conversation is the role of storytelling and imagination in moral formation. And I think, we talk to parents quite a bit as we go through this and, how do we teach our kids these lessons and these ideas? But it extends to adults as well. As pastors, we so frequently use illustrations and stories to relay our points.
I mean, that's what they teach you, like when you're learning how to preach, is like put those stories in there, like all the time. Like you need some sort of story, like whether you begin, end, make your points.
I mean, there's
regular.
entire websites dedicated to these things that pastors generally steal from. I would take a guess.
Back in the day, like you could just hear it when they would start like the story, they pulled it from a book. And so
Yeah.
there's a good way and there's a bad way, but we're going to talk today about the good way, the good use of this with families and raising kids. So
I pull stories from a book on a regular basis, parables from a book on a regular basis that work pretty well.
Oh yeah, well that book, yeah, you can use that book.
Okay.
But I'm just saying the stock book was always like you need good stories.
Stacy, we're talking about
you
the
need
Bible.
the good stories.
Just want to make sure we're all on the same page. All right. So with all that said, how far? Just give me an idea of how this plays a part in moral formation. So how does the imagination play a part in moral formation? Because it kind of seems like it wouldn't, right? Like how does the imagination have its part in this whole thing?
Well, I think that's where you think we want more like direct teaching, and so I think that's why we wouldn't necessarily go directly to imagination, but I think that's why it's overlooked. And even going all the way back, and you talk about Plato, Aristotle, the early Greeks, like they understood, the Greeks and the Romans knew that's why they had these stories, the myths. That's why they developed these things. That was all part of learning how the world worked and how to value things. And so I think in our modern day, it's much more efficient. Just give the rule, follow the rule. And we've lost something in that process.
Yeah, and the didactic teaching doesn't have the impact on a child that a story does. You can tell a child not to lie and even tell them that, the Bible teaches us not to lie. And they can learn that rule. But if you read to them, for example, like Pinocchio, and they can kind of live vicariously through that story and see what happens to Pinocchio as a consequence of lying, that has a greater impact on their soul and their imagination and learning how that virtue actually plays out in real life other than just, mommy and daddy told me not to lie.
Yeah, I think if you ask a majority of adults throughout the world and you ask them about a story that talks about lying, I think most of us go to either Pinocchio or The Boy Who Cried Wolf. Like and it has had such an impact on us, throughout time. And I feel like as adults, though, we so often forget our imagination or lose it or stop using it. Today we had co-op today, and I asked the middle schoolers to give a piece of advice to all the younger kids. And I said, so what are give one piece of advice to these young kids. And one of the kids said that characters in books can be your best friend.
Mm-hmm.
And I sat there and I listened to that and I was like, well, that was interesting because as an adult, I don't think that way, but that imagination that they have is so powerful in their formation.
Mm-hmm. And I think where we even as adults, there's that unity that we find when there's that movie that people will quote, and there's that, like even the stories. And I think about, like, this is why one of the reasons why we teach Shakespeare is because so many people around the world who's read Shakespeare and heard those lines, there's an element, there's this shared understanding. So I think that's the other advantage behind those characters is, like, it's not just you. There's could be, I mean, particularly with the classics, you're joining in with hundreds, if not thousands of years of people who share that same friend, that same concept, that same notion. You've become part of this conversation and you understand it. And that's where that power behind using the stories and the way that you, particularly when it's a story and you care about and you understand what happened and you see that, like when you're talking about And I know you may not care as much, like when I used like the Star Wars references
I
and
knew you
things,
were
but
going to. I knew
oh
for a
yes,
fact
oh
we were
yes,
going to talk about it.
yes, because when I talk about, when I've been betrayed and I say something, like, well, he was my Anakin, that just that one name drop connects with the story. It connects with the feelings, the emotions are all there, and you think about the betrayal and you think about the larger story just by the name drop. And so I think that's what helps with the children when they understand those stories, and you say, you bring up the name, you bring up that idea, it carries with it all of the emotions, all the feelings. And I think that's again in some ways what we're missing. I think we do understand this as adults in a way. We have some of these favorite stories. We have a shared understanding, even if you don't like the Star Wars, you're not into those
I
things,
don't
and you don't
dislike
know.
it.
I know, but if that doesn't resonate, others do. There are other places and other things that, as soon as you hear that, it pulls your heart. And that's why when we're teaching like public speaking, like they need to know, and that's like we have the fancy Greek words, the logos, that's the information. You need to know the information. But the pathos, the passions, the emotions, that's where the stories come in and achieve this. And I think that's why, as we're looking, how do we cultivate, because this goes back to how do we cultivate these virtues? Virtues, we always say they have to be taught, they have to be caught, you have to show them, and we've talked many times. But that idea of seeking them, that they must be sought, this is where the stories come into it. It makes the children, they want to be that way. They want to be the good one. They want to join the hero almost. And that's powerful in trying to cultivate these virtues. There's another motivating side to that.
Right.
I would argue also that virtues can be caught from stories.
Mm-hmm.
When you're reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you want to be brave like Peter, and you don't want to betray your family like Edmund. Like you see those things played out and how those virtues, are enacted in the story, and children, look up to those heroes, like you said, or their best friend character or whatever, and they have other examples than just their parents or their siblings to see how those virtues, um, actually play out, even though it might be from a fictional character.
So before we continue, I'm going to read Matthew 13:10 through 13. It says, Then the disciples came and said to him, Why do you speak to them in parables? And he answered them, speaking of Jesus. He says, To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For the one who has more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. And so I want to make sure that we're talking to parents, and we're talking about children, but it extends so much further into adults as well. For, I would say, decades, I don't think I read a single fiction book because it just didn't make sense to me why I would do that. Now, don't throw anything at me. But recently, because of you, Miss Stacy here, I don't even know how it happened. I don't remember how I got roped into it, but I read a book called Pride and Prejudice, and I had this idea of reading some of these classics that are absolutely fiction, right? But it was the first time I'd read anything that even talked about virtues.
Mm-hmm.
And so even this classic literature, and I'm not really proud to admit how much I got sucked into that book and part of the story as a grown man, but it was fantastic. And I hate to admit it, but I've read many more fiction books that Stacy's recommended. And so I even those of us who think that we're outside of this, I just know through those stories that, we've been talking about virtue and we've been talking about these ideas, that through these stories, I got to see them a little bit more in play with the language, the kind of the classical language on how they were talked about. And so I think it's important that we don't just kind of dismiss this,
Mm-hmm.
Well,
and I think that's where, because Stacy got me, and I think my oldest, we were looking at reading Jane Eyre, and
she got me on that one too. That one was also good.
Okay, so I'm 2 chapters in, so
It's worth reading.
not very much into it, but I'm just a little bit, and I think this is why we're talking about the powers of the story, because Stacy asked me, well, what have I read? And well, not a lot's happened. We have a little girl, and she's just basically being mistreated. But the whole idea is like, and what's difficult for me is as I'm reading the story, like I'm really mad. Like I'm watching this
The fact
happen.
that books can evoke emotion, like
Right.
fiction books can evoke emotion in me, is wild.
But that's the thing. Like I'm watching the story, and I'm frustrated, and I'm upset, and but this is what the story is trying to do. It's trying to set up. I don't know, and I know how stories operate, so I don't know what. I have not read the book, not watched anything. Like I don't know the story.
Me neither.
So as
Well, I
I'm
didn't,
going
but-
through, there's an element of already it's drawing me in, and I'm going to the idea is whatever it's trying to teach me, I'm going to learn. I'm going to receive this. I think it was, I might get the name wrong. Campbell, I think was his last name. I don't think it was Joseph Campbell. One of the Campbells who talks about the hero journey. He wrote
Mhm.
this whole massive book about there's only so many stories and the whole movement of the hero's journey. And this is why when you're when you're reading a book, you're watching a movie, whatever it is, the really good ones have this hero's journey, and you join them. And that's why bad books, bad literature, bad movies, bad TV, this is the great danger, is because you join the anti-heroes. Like the
Yep.
way the modern movie where the difference between someone like the Spider-Man versus the Deadpool. When you think of like the heroes movies, like Deadpool is absolutely a terrible person, and you sympathize with him,
Yep.
and you enjoy what he's doing, and you actually become a worse person by experiencing these stories. And so that's why we also want to be clear, like it's not about just give them any story. Like
Yeah.
you need good stories that offer virtue, that offer
Mhm.
this journey, that you have this inspiration. I want to be like this person. I want to be that kind of hero. I want to stand firm. Or
Yep.
when you have the villains, like in the case of these kids who are just awful humans, I think one of the reasons why I get upset is because I see myself like when I was a kid,
Mm,
and I know which character I would be, and I don't like that.
mhm.
And I see this reflection, and it helps me. And so it's a more creative way of teaching, rather than like going through a workbook or going through a class.
Yeah.
Like to use literature this way, and it's fun. You can do this with your kids. You can, even the older ones. Like I said, our oldest he loves reading stories, and he's actually been getting into some of the books that I've read, and he's taking this journey. We're having these conversations about the hero, and one of those is like with the Dune saga. So again, sci-fi. I know, okay, not your cup of tea, but so just point it out there. I just
It's fine.
recognize, it's
I didn't think I'd like Pride and Prejudice. Maybe I would like. No, probably not. But
maybe that's the next challenge,
maybe that
because
is.
there's like in the Dune, there is this question. You have this moral ambiguity. Is he really the good guy? Is he not? What's the right things to do in these situations? You have such a complex situation. And that's what my son and I were able to discuss. Like, what is the right way to handle these villains? What is the right way to go about if you know that humanity needs something? How far are you willing to go to make that thing happen? And it actually, like in the case of Dune, it doesn't offer the suggestions, but it gives my son and I this chance to discuss these situations. They're entirely hypothetical because it involves like space and time and all these other weird things. But they're very real dilemmas. They're very real in the sense, how do you apply the concept of the good? How do you apply justice? How do you apply fairness? How do you apply what is the good use of freedom? What is, one of the things Dune shows is the abuse of like the way religion is used to control people.
Mm.
And like even in our own religion, even inside Christianity, where have we gone wrong? Where have we abused our power? Where have we gotten wrong? Where are we more like the Pharisees? Because you have some of that in there. So
I got the two best people I could have to ask this question, because I think you guys bring up a really good example. Okay, so we're talking about your oldest. He's 15,
Mhm.
right? I went to a school that stressed this kind of stuff in grade school and high school, and I read a bunch of books. But I read them because I was supposed to read them, and I did stupid book reports because I was supposed to do silly book reports, and I don't remember a single thing, nor did I appreciate what I was reading or care about it. You guys have a 15-year-old, and how old's the middle one?
11.
An 11-year-old who devour books. And you guys are having entire conversations with them, and you both are also voracious readers. So without just kind of making the assumption that most people are readers, because I don't really think that they are, how do you even develop, like, how do you start this idea of gleaning from stories, whether they be books or movies or TV shows? How do you even start gleaning from these, the family conversations of the moral formation? Like, because it doesn't just happen, right? Like, you've got to develop this, I would assume.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it starts with just pure enjoyment and delight in stories and developing their appetite for reading. And when they're younger, you don't want to like dissect a story and completely analyze every single part. You want that story to just kind of soak into who they are. And I'm a very firm believer that stories become part of us. Like once you've read a story, it's like you can't like unread it. You know, you can't, you might forget it or,
Right.
you know, maybe not understand the whole thing, but it's, you know, once you've seen something, you can't unsee it. Once you read it, you can't unread it. That those books really do form our identities and shape our souls in a lot of ways. So when they're younger, it is really just about enjoying the stories, reading fairy tales, just recognizing good and evil and not necessarily having the goal of, okay, let's have a conversation about, you know, who is good and who is evil and, you know, don't be like, you know, this person or whatever, but allowing that story to just do its job. But then as they get older and those moral questions do come up, then it is just about having a conversation and not a quiz of like, you know, what color shirt was Lucy wearing when she walked through the
Right.
wardrobe,
Right.
which is what most comprehension, you know, questions are asking kids. But, you know, what would you have done if you were Lucy? You
Right.
know, would you have, you know, helped Mr. Tumnus or, you know, whatever? Or would you, you know, if you were Edmund, would you have taken the Turkish delight from the White Witch? You know, those kinds of questions, just getting them thinking. And again, it's not the goal of like, you know,
Do you know how many times I've tried to figure out what Turkish delight is and I want to try it so bad.
it's
Anyway, sorry.
it's
Since
not
I was a kid.
about like, okay, like, you know, Lucy was a good girl, like be like Lucy, you know, like turning it into that didactic teaching again, but you know, identifying with the characters in the story and, you know, again, having that conversation without like beating the kid over the head with the book. Like, did you learn the lesson you were supposed to learn, you know, from this book?
I think that's how I grew up. I mean,
Yeah.
and
And
I love reading,
it-
but I didn't like reading fiction because of this.
yeah, it sucks all the fun out of it.
Mhm.
And it actually prevents the story from doing its job when you're just, again, dissecting and analyzing it to death.
So I think it's worth mentioning two things. First of all, shout out to South Africa that was the first place I was when I had Turkish delight. So I had somebody who specifically took me, and it was that reference like, oh, if you know the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. She's like, have you ever had this? I was like, no, and so we went. So awesome. But again, that shared experience. So I know
There's a note for that.
yeah, there,
Alright.
yeah. Next time we go.
Next time.
Next time.
Turkish delight.
So the second thing, and I know probably some people who are listening are wondering, they're just like, wait a minute, you know, this is you know, this is a Christian group. Why are we not just reading the Bible? Because I think that comes up sometimes. Like, you know, you know, and we play the super pies. Well, I'm just reading the Bible, but the idea is the well-written literature, which many times like C.S. Lewis and others, they're writing from very Christian worldview, and
Absolutely.
the principles are there, and we see it in a different way. Like I mean, C.S. Lewis specifically was more or less like a Christian allegory. Like
Yep.
those things are on purpose. Tolkien did not like allegory, but his Christian faith was absolutely part and parcel with this story. And you see justice, you see true mercy played out, you see the virtues of magnanimity, you see just this
Yeah, that's the Lord of the Rings book.
the Lord of the Rings. Yes. So it's your
I think we're making a lot of assumptions.
we
here
are making
that-
assumptions.
and
Sorry.
I think that
Sorry.
honestly, I think if probably a lot of the circles, we obviously run in different circles, but a lot of the circles you run in, these
Mhm.
are very normal conversations to have. But there's a lot of
Mhm.
circles that I run in that I could bring up these authors and nobody would know what I'm talking
Right.
about.
So I think I think this goes back to your question though, like how do you get into this? Because I was not a reader when I was young at all. Like
Mhm.
it wasn't until middle school so like grade 8 or so, I was forced to read some books, and it caught my interest for the first time. Like I read books like it was Animal Farm was one of them that I read, and I was just like, whoa. And I did not even remotely understand the historical
The
significance of
complexity of it, yeah.
what this was communicating. But I understood something was there. And other books, it started me moving, and I started looking for the kinds of stories and the kinds of things that did interest me. But I also didn't have any guidance when I was in high school, so I ended up reading a lot of those things that I could not unread, that were not the good things.
I do want to stress we do want people to read the Bible
Right, absolutely.
primarily. That would be
Yes.
great. Read that. But there's so much more that, like this idea, this imagination, this it can lend the moral formation of not just our children, I think, but to us.
Hmm.
And I don't think there's an age at which it stops.
Yep. And all books that are well written and that are virtuous, that are not disordered. I wanted to bring that up. Like when Thomas was talking about, I mean, the total trend these days is to, empathize with the villain. And
Mhm.
oh, the villain's not a bad person. They would just have trauma, in their past or whatever, and we just need to understand the villain. That is disordered.
Yeah, it is
Like
disorder.
God wants us to recognize the good as good and evil as evil and not try to explain it away somehow. So I wanted to piggyback off of you on that,
Mhm.
but I didn't get a chance to. And then um and then also um talking about stories, like even stories that may be written by a non-Christian, they're still going to have those Christian metaphors and Christian themes. You have that example of sacrifice, in books like Harry Potter and things like that, making that, ultimate sacrifice for somebody else. Even again, if the author didn't even do that intentionally, that's pointing us back to Christ's sacrifice, whether they meant to do it or not.
Mm.
It comes back to that idea of all truth is God's truth, and that all stories point to the story ultimately, and that you have, whenever even in the fairy tales, like when you have like Snow White and Sleeping Beauty that are asleep and then they're resurrected before the end of the story. And a lot of those fairy tales end with a wedding and end with a feast, just like the Bible does. And those metaphors are so tightly wrapped up in that you don't even recognize it unless somebody, points it out to you. But that was kind of what I was talking about before, about how stories just form your soul without you even knowing it, and that we have those representations of, kind of those foundational truths and the picture of Christ and the picture of the gospel. Um, when we're just reading the real fairy tales.
I'll never watch those again the same, to be
To
honest. I've
if
never
you
thought
the
about that.
very end of the movie Snow White, it looks like heaven when they ride off into the sunset.
Huh.
Yeah.
Huh. Super cool.
Yeah.
I will never look at it the same way, but I think really the ultimate of what I hear you saying is that these stories are important, and if they form your soul and they really just grab a hold of you and are a part of you, then I think it's really important that we guard our children's
Absolutely.
hearts, ears, eyes, and
Mhm.
souls by what they take in.
Yep.
We give them things of rightly ordered loves and rightly ordered passions, and we feed them, the things that we want them to be, and not allow them to devolve into these villain loving, and wanting to be
Yeah.
like, where they're mimicking the wrong things.
Yeah.
They champion the vices rather than the virtues.
Yeah, we don't want that.
Right.
Well, McCuddies, I appreciate the conversation as always. And you can find us at familiesofvirtue.com. And our podcast, Virtuous Roots, is on all major streaming platforms. Be blessed, and we will talk to you next time.